I'm really happy to introduce Claudia Thompson. She came to Piper Shores in 2023, just after our second campus opened up, and she brought with her all kinds of wisdom and knowledge, ecological wisdom and knowledge as a result of a long career as an environmentalist. In addition to the role she played in founding and leading um, Pro Native Massachusetts, the Native Plants Advocacy and Education Group that was mentioned in the announcement to this program. She was the Director of Education for the Appalachian Mountain Club, a Director of Massachusetts Audubon's Drumlin Farm, on the Board of Directors of the Massachusetts Wildflower Society. And at one point, Claudia wrote, conservation is not just something confined to places we, quote, set aside. It's something that we need to begin at home and make integral into our actions everywhere. And she put that preaching into practice in her own small yard in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She has a wonderful talk which she's delivered here at Piper Shores and elsewhere on the development of this native plant garden, where she documented over 80 bird species. But most relevant to us is when she came to Piper Shores, she immediately set to work transforming the knowledge and sensibilities of both residents and key administration um, about landscape management. And her efforts informed two new landscape master plans, one for each campus, which you'll be able to read about in the upcoming issue of the SAFE newsletter. But right now, she's going to talk to us about ditching our customary practices of fall cleanup to myriad benefit. Claudia.
Well, thank you very much, Larry. I appreciate the generous introduction. And let me just set up my screen sharing here. Is that working for people?
Yep.
Great. Thank you again, and thank you so much, Jenna and Michelle, for inviting me to do this, and for all of you for being here. It's tremendous change has happened in the approach to landscaping in the last few decades, and there's a lot of tremendous change that I hope will continue to happen, and we can all make a big difference. So jump in. I think that one of the most important things about landscapes that we all love when we see them and sense their beauty is we sense this ecological richness. And that gives us a sense of peace and a sense of joy. We actually may not know exactly what we're experiencing, except that we really sense that there's an ecological system that's working. And it might be that we see the bunchberry flowers in the carpet on the forest floor emerging through the haircut moss, or the duff, the leaves, the joy of all of that together. Or maybe we see pitcher plants, which are carnivores, and they're actually in there with the water inside their pitcher, and they're capturing insects so they can survive as a plant eating an animal. And here we have pitcher plants in a cultivated garden at the New York Botanical Gardens Native Plant Garden that were planted only a little over a decade ago in the Bronx. So they're in the midst of a very urban setting, and yet they're performing that same function and giving that same beauty. And of course, we have the decomposers, the incredible diversity of fungi and soil fauna that are so essential to making life work on this planet. These shaggy mane inkblot mushrooms will only last a day or two before they dissolve in black blobs into the soil. And all of our landscapes and everything on our gardens are part of this cycle, this incredible nutrient cycle of growth and decay and sun and inputs. And think about it, conventional landscaping actually is built on interrupting those processes rather than working with them. So the essential core of a sustainable future is that we need to work with those systems and stop interfering with them and tap them and only add inputs where inputs are needed and not waste things that aren't needed and not throw out lots of greenhouse gases doing things that aren't needed. And in turn, all of these life cycles of decay and rejuvenation are inherent to our seasons, to our seasonal cycles. Here we are on this tiny little orb of a planet, and we're circling the sun at 67,000 miles per hour. And it's that itself and the rotation and this entire planetary system that makes life possible as well. So I like this thought from Tim Goring, which is death is the start of a beginning. Life is the start of an end, and the cycle continues forever. And I will say that being part of a retirement community and being here does help me think about those things more and more. And those are beautiful things. They're really important to life on Earth. So winter is a time of renewal, whether we are plant or animal. Whether we're on an annual cycle of, say, we're an annual plant or a butterfly or a moth or a bee, and our annual cycle is tied to an annual reproduction process, or whether we're a perennial or an animal that lives over multiple years, but winter is our time for rest or hibernation or regeneration, all of those seasons also make life possible. So as Larry mentioned, I've had a career with a lot of opportunities to work in environmental education as an ecologist and in the environmental sphere. And I think, like most of us, what has taught me the most in some ways about these systems is my own garden in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I had the privilege of working on it for 31 years. Roger and I, my husband, bought a total wreck of a house with nothing a lot to recommend the landscape. And this was the garden of sort of midway through my process. And what I learned the most about systems was that the leaves and the decaying cycles do the work. Over time, the soil becomes conditioned by the plants that live there. The plants are actually training the soil. As I planted more and more native species, the cycles would work. I didn't use fertilizer. I did use some organic inputs such as bone meal and compost. But I didn't use any chemical fertilizer except maybe a few early on times when I didn't know any better. And it was amazing to learn from the growth patterns and watching them and getting the opportunity to be a player in that. So there are four big things that I want to talk about that are essential to understanding our landscapes as system. And we have to start with leaf litter, right? Leave the leaves is the mantra these days. Leaf litter is an absolute miracle. And so it is this, why is it so fabulous? Why would we want to get rid of it? It's critical to life cycles and the reproduction of fauna, moths and butterflies, bees, and so many insects. It's actually critical to the reproduction of plants. It is a source of food for birds, amphibian, and reptiles because leaf litter is full of all these organisms that are living within it. And so birds and other fauna are eating elements within the leaf litter all the time. And it's really essential for this cycling of nutrients. It's the heart of our gardens in so many ways. Now, I don't know how many of you might have seen a hummingbird moth. They're really, really cool. And they are a little smaller than a hummingbird. This is a snowberry clearwing moth. And you can grow all the flowers you want, and you might see hummingbird moths and have that joy. But if you do not leave your leaves in your landscapes and your garden, you will not have hummingbird moths next year. And why is that? In New England, most moths and butterflies have one life cycle per year. So the hummingbird moth lays her eggs on the host plant. The larva grows into the caterpillars. The caterpillars drop to the ground in the fall, and they pupate. And this pupa of a hummingbird moth, and here you see it for scale in the hand, has to overwinter in the leaf litter all winter long before it emerges next year into a new butterfly, into a new moth. And so imagine if we had raked up that leaf litter or blown away that leaf litter, we would have blown away that pupa. And that's true for, again, virtually all butterflies. The mourning cloak butterfly overwinters as an adult in the leaf litter. So in the spring, that adults come out, they mate. This is a case of the mourning cloak. The male and the female mate. Their larvae grow into and with moths and butterflies, after they mate, they die. That's inherent in their life cycle. So their larvae, after the eggs are laid, grow into caterpillars, they pupate, they become the next generation of adults that summer. They feed briefly, and then in that fall, they go and hibernate again, and they overwinter in the leaf litter one more time. So all these butterflies and moths, and again, most of the butterflies and moths in our system depend on that cycle of the system. And it's either overwintering as an adult, overwintering as an egg, or a caterpillar, or a chrysalis. In one of those forms, they overwinter in the leaf litter or in a soil-related situation. And then let's talk about bumblebees. So pollinators are the big thing. There are many different kinds of pollinators, and bumblebees are their own small group. It is only, I think we all know this, but it's only the queen bumblebee that survives the winter and creates an entire new brood the following year. So if that queen does not survive, we will not have more bumblebees next year. Now, the queen likes to overwinter and hibernate in a little teeny hole in the ground, but that is usually covered by leaf litter to protect it. So again, the leaf litter and that soil layer is very important to the reproduction of bumblebees. And as I mentioned, leaf litter is this incredible food source for bird survival. All kinds of invertebrates get plucked out of that leaf litter to feed the young of birds. And if you see a conventional landscape with a lot of bark mulch, you generally don't see a lot of birds foraging there. But if you have a nice landscape or a little wooded area with the leaf litter and all those soil systems naturally happening, you will see lots of birds hunting around for insects and creatures, but not if you just lay down in general a layer of that bark mulch. A lot of which is dyed, which is not so great either. So think about it, a tremendous number of our bird species are ground feeders, which is again why that soil ecosystem is so important. And in the last 50 years, it's estimated that in North America, we have lost 1/3 of the bird populations we had 50 years ago. And it varies a little bit species to species, but the population losses are extremely great in the woodland birds here in New England and in the grassland birds. And why are we losing so many birds? A huge reason is habitat loss. Now think about leaf litter and how much leaf litter might have been in North America 50 years ago. So 50 years ago was what, the 70s. And 50 years ago is getting, I measure, of course, we all measure in our lifetimes, but think about how much development has happened, say, post-World War II into the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and think about how much, every time development happens, woodlands get stripped away, grasslands get stripped away, and what do people put in? They put in turf. And how much is left for the birds? Not much, and other things. Now, I have some favorite woodland plants. My garden in Cambridge had more of a woodland character than I do at Piper Shores now, which is more of a sunny meadow character where I am. But I had a lot of woodland plants in my garden. And here we have jack-in-the-pulpits on the left and trilliums in the middle. These are some of our most beautiful New England spring wildflowers, and there are trilliums and jack-in-pulpits of different species out west as well. If I had not left that leaf litter, I would never have had those trilliums and the jack-in-the-pulpits for several reasons. First of all, both trilliums and jack-in-the-pulpits, when they first emerge from a seedling, have to grow for 5 to 7 years before they ever produce a flower. So let's take a trillium. In the case of a trillium, the first year that a trillium seedling, first of all, the seedlings have to drop to the ground and they have to overwinter and cold stratify. They have to live through a cold New England winter. In the spring, if a trillium seed is lucky enough to be in a place where it can sprout and emerge, it's only going to be like a part of not even an inch tall at most in the first year. And then it senesces next winter, and then the next year it'll grow a little bit bigger. And by year 3, maybe it grows to 2 or 3 inches tall when it emerges. 7 years before it's large enough to produce that first flower. And so if you take up that leaf litter, one, the seeds aren't going to emerge and sprout in the first place. But if you did have seeds or plants that were trying to grow to be mature enough to flower, you would have stripped that seedling off. And so you would never get trilliums. And you would not get jack-in-the-pulpits, because jack-in-the-pulpits take 5 full years before they ever produce that first jack or produce those first seeds. And again, the seeds will drop to the ground, and that's the jack-in-the-pulpit seeds. They're really quite beautiful in the fall, and they'll get often carried by ants and spread around, but leave them alone. Now, my trillium and my little jack-in-the-pulpit patch in my garden, I would get so mad if there were squirrels near that. I mean, it's just like, of course, there is natural disturbance from other animals. So that's why, you need enough seeds, because how many will survive? But I did not touch that patch. There was a whole part of my garden that I did not go in and try to disturb. And bloodroot's another example of a beautiful New England spring wildflower that depends on the leaf litter and that cycle. The bloodroot, this is a patch of bloodroot that grew in my Cambridge garden that took many years. I originally bought 4 single plants from a garden in the woods, which is, if you all know, native plants, a great source and was a really good, important grower of native wildflowers. Probably in the 1990s, at some point, I bought 4 plants. And steadily through the years, I got this colony of bloodroot plants that look like this. But how many years, then this was only part of the colony. The colony was actually quite extensive in my understory. It took 10 to 15 years to make that colony of plants. Okay, but every year, more of them would reproduce. The ants, this is an ant carrying a bloodroot seed. And you can see the seed is bigger than the ant. And the seed has this fleshy elaiosome that is food for the ants. So the ants like to carry the seeds, eat the elaiosome, drop the seed because they don't want it. And that's part of what helps distribute these bloodroots across the landscape in that lovely leaf litter. And there are many other plants that will self-sow in your garden and add ecological beauty. So you don't have to always plant your garden. The idea of working ecologically is that not that you plant every single thing. You try to create the conditions so that plants will reproduce, so that you're creating the type of habitat you want, but you're not trying to manage and control every single piece of flora in that system that's growing. You're trying to get the system to work. The lovely thing about these 2 plants, columbine and wild bleeding heart, is they don't like lots of competition. So they'll sow their seeds all around, but sometimes you'll see them germinate in cracks in the rocks, in all kinds of places where you would have never thought to plant something. So that's another lovely part of having plants self-sow, is they will show up where they want to be, where they're well adapted to be. And a lot of times we don't even know that, so they teach us things. So the great thing about leaf litter is that it arrives free by special delivery, gently distributed into your landscape every year, serving as fertilizer and mulch. And in the spring, it's suppressing weeds. And yet, as plants just begin to emerge, say early in April, a few weeks later, all those understory wildflowers are perfectly adapted to coming up through that leaf litter. The garden fills in, and it's really nice when you have a layer of trees and shrubs and a rich understory of ground plain plants, so that you don't have to do a lot of weeding, and so that you're getting that organic cycling of nutrients to work really well. And your perennials your delicate little native perennials are adapted to coming up through that woodland leaf litter. So here we have the coils of maidenhair fern, the Canada ginger, which is that low ground cover, the leaves that are hugging the ground there, a beautiful wildflower, Uvularia sicilifolia, no problem, just poking their little sprouts up every spring through the leaves. These, again, this is a anemone, Anemonella thalictroides, and the Uvularia, lovely combination. And there are a few plants that are ground covers that won't withstand a lot of leaf litter covers, a few ground covers like certain phloxes and things. Those in their native habitat, the plants that are not adapted to that tend to grow on slopes, so that they've learned their suitable habitat actually naturally sheds the leaf litter so that they can emerge. So it's not that you can grow every single species equally, but you're trying to find the plants that are adapted to the right conditions in the right place. And now let's talk about the value of leaf litter to soil itself. It's really, really important. And there are no good diagrams to show the soil food web, to show how complex it is and to show the incredible diversity of life within it. And we still have a lot to learn about the soil food web. But the essential truths are these. There's a wide variety of fungi, bacteria, invertebrates of all kinds, arthropods, of insects, etc. And then there's this wide variety of fauna, of birds, of amphibians, of mammals, who again interact with that system, who eat some of the food within that system, who add their own nutrients when they defecate, etc. So leaf litter is a major soil builder. It's essential for habitat and for the whole ecological system itself and the other creatures. It's essential for recycling carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and all the compounds for plant growth. It's great at filtering and absorbing rainwater and therefore preventing erosion. When you have a rich soil with your little duff at the top and the decaying leaves, and a healthy soil with some organic matter in it. Not all soil also needs to be equal in its organic matter. That's another, we don't necessarily want compost everywhere. But to grow things, soil has to have some organic matter, and richer organic matter for certain plants and tougher soil with less organic matter for other plants. But the organic matter is what lightens the soil and gives it a little more structure so that it can absorb water. And as I mentioned, native plants tend to build their own soil chemistry. And if you've got plants that are well adapted for the soil, they, again, interact in ways we don't fully understand yet, but they actually affect the pH of soil. They affect other things about the soil so that they get what they need. And the bottom line is that more carbon is stored in soil than in the atmosphere and in the biomass above it. And this is true at a planetary level. So if we have a rich woodland, and we all think of trees as being, carbon storers, and we plant trees so that we're storing more carbon. Well, a really well-developed meadow with these plants have very deep root system, can equally store very high amounts of carbon. And it is that living system that is very, very important in climate change issues and carbon storage. Okay, so don't be a deadhead. Well, what is a deadhead? Well, one definition is a boring person. None of us are deadheads. Another definition would be, for those of us who grew up in the 60s and 70s, you were a follower of the Grateful Dead. I was not a deadhead, but I know many people who were. But the real definition of a deadhead is a free rider, somebody who doesn't pay for their ticket. And when we deadhead plants, that's what we do. We make them free riders because they're not giving back to the system very well once they're decapitated. So in the case of how much we love our birds and we'd like to feed our birds, and we set out bird feeders for them, well, the best feeders we can give birds when they need seed are the plants. It's the healthiest way to feed them, and it's more fun actually to watch them. And many of the finches, of course, are predominantly seed eaters. Bird diets do evolve a lot with the seasons. In general, birds eat more insects in spring and more seeds in fall. That's kind of obvious why that would be. But also because in order for their young to grow, insects supply a lot more protein, and that allows the young baby birds that have hatched to grow soon enough so that they can get out of the nest. But seeds are a really important source of food for many, many bird species. And so here we have our goldfinch on the Rudbeckia, and also goldfinches love echinacea. And here's a redpoll on Anothera biennis, which is a great native plant. There are just so many plants that if you leave them and don't deadhead them, you will get the pleasure of watching birds enjoying them. And another reason not to deadhead your plants is to let them go to seed so that you'll still have the plants that you want in your garden. So cardinal flower is not a long-lived perennial. I love cardinal flower. I have some cardinal flower. This was my garden in Cambridge, but I have some cardinal flower I planted here at Piper Shores. And literally, my husband and I, for the past month and a half, have seen the hummingbirds of the cardinal flower almost every hour, on the hour, every day for the last month and a half. So there are other good things you can plant if you like hummingbirds, but cardinal flower is truly a great source of nectar for hummingbirds, much more nutritious than sugar water. And it's the only pollinator for cardinal flower. So if you don't have hummingbirds, you won't get your cardinal flower to stay in your garden. So since cardinal flower only lives for a couple years before it dies back, it has to reseed itself if you still want it in your garden. And to reseed, it also needs disturbance. So one thing I learned over time when I planted a few cardinal flowers in my little meadow strip and they disappeared after a couple of years, Larry Weiner taught me, is okay, disturbance is needed for those little they're teeny seeds that come out of the cardinal flower, smaller than poppy seeds. And so I planted them by the downspout in my garden, hoping that would give them enough disturbance to reseed, and it worked perfectly. So this cardinal flower patch persisted for the entire time that I had the house in Cambridge and had figured that out. So again, understanding plants, understanding their cycles, and letting them reproduce under the conditions they need is what keeps our gardens really fun. And then there are cavity nesting bees. Of course, there are probably in northern New England about 300 species of native bees. Of those native bees, maybe a third of them need to nest in some type of tubular structure, whether it's the hollow stem of plants that have hollow stems, whether it's tunnels that bore into decaying wood, or some other burrowing place. And we can create, these bee houses, but honestly, that isn't going to save the ecosystem. We really need the habitat for those bees. So here's Heather Holm is this wonderful person who's expert on bees and pollinators and good techniques. If you don't know of her, she's a good author to look up with some great books. But in general, with deadheading plants, it's recommended that you not deadhead them if possible. If you do feel a need to deadhead them, you can cut them back and leave the stems, 12 inches long. And then, what I do with most of them, unless it's really a plant that's just so prolific, I don't want it colonizing my garden too much, is I just cut up those stems. If I do cut something down in the very late spring, after they've served its ecological purpose, and let it decay into the ground. It's part of that organic cycling system, just the way leaf litter is. So here's some other native plants that are really important, where their stems are important to stem nesting bees. Again, I encourage you to look at the work of Heather Holm to learn more about this. And then everybody at Piper Shores knows how much I love snags, because a lot of people have seen the story of my woodpecker nesting. But think about it. Snags are beautiful, brush and logs. All of these things are part of those cycles. And we are constantly taking them away. And we're therefore completely breaking down an ecological system that's designed to work throughout the seasons. So I created this snag in Cambridge. And what I wanted to do was to see if I could get downy woodpeckers to nest in my small urban garden. My garden was only 7,000 square feet. And indeed it worked. it was very, very exciting. And so in 2013, after several years of decaying and having created this standing snag, a downy woodpecker came and started drilling a hole in my tree in the backyard. And it took about 3 weeks for the downy, it was mostly the male that built the nest, took about 3 weeks for the downy male to drill this hole in this standing snag, standing dead tree. And then I actually think I saw the male and the female mating, and then they got really quiet, and I wasn't sure if they had laid eggs in that nest, but finally I saw this after took about, let's say, about 3 weeks for the nest to get drilled. Takes about 2 weeks to incubate the eggs for downy woodpeckers. And then from there, so they've hatched after that period, it takes about 3 to 4 weeks for the young to grow large enough to fledge. So for 3 to 4 weeks, my husband and I watched the male and female downy woodpecker flying back and forth with mouths full of caterpillars to feed the young. There were 2 young woodpeckers in that nest. And it was incredible to think that I'm sitting in my garden in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I could drink coffee on the porch and just watch these woodpeckers coming back and feeding their babies. And finally, on June 1st, the male fledged. It took only, amazingly, this was new to me, and I'm an ecologist. It took 12 minutes for that male, once the parents left him alone and kind of stopped feeding him so that he was, I'm hungry, and whining and complaining, and push himself out of the nest and grab the side of the tree. 12 minutes from the time he fledged till he flew out of the yard. And then that's it. Downy woodpeckers are done. The parents don't feed them after that. That's not true for all baby birds, but that was pretty cool. And then there was a female that fledged a few days later. So what does all this say? It says there's not enough habitat for these birds. If I could, if they want to come, this is why nature's not out there. They were happy to find that snag in Cambridge, Massachusetts, because how many snags do they have? And again, my Piper Shores friends know I'm a big advocate for leaving standing deadwood because it's so important to our cavity nesting birds. We have primary cavity nesters that are the woodpeckers and the few birds that can actually drill the holes, but we have a lot of secondary cavity nesters like nuthatches and chickadees and brown creepers that actually use the nests, abandoned nests, from woodpeckers and other species. So there's a huge number of bird species that without snags can never nest and can never reproduce. And I think I would have liked to have had this snag in my backyard because I really like its natural form and its artistic shape. So I urge you to build a relationship with snags because snags are wonderful to have in our landscapes. And brush piles are important too. Dark-eyed junco here is looking for food. A lot of brush piles are important for hiding, etc. And so you can use trimmings and branches to create brush piles in discrete parts of the landscape where you don't mind a little of that and where they can decay and provide habitat at the same time that they're decaying and providing nutrients for the soil. So the message is don't take your resources off-site. All your resources, your leaves, your snags, your decaying wood, as much as possible, let them work for you in your system. And in the limited cases where it may make sense to remove things on pathways or highly managed areas, find ways to reuse your material, your organic material on site as much as possible. So finally, I just want to talk a little bit about how this is so important to use organic processes in this era of climate change. And I want to talk about the difference between organic and chemical fertilizers and how the consumption of fossil fuels totally dominates conventional gardening. If we could radically reform our gardening practices, the impact on carbon production, on climate change would be absolutely profound. Nobody adequately measures in any sustainability studies that I've seen. I don't see any adequate measurements of this huge impact of both fossil fuel consumption and machinery use in the way we practice to manage current management of our landscape. So we all know we're in a crisis. I don't need to repeat that. We all know that the frequency of our extreme weather events is increasing very dramatically. How does this relate to the chemical fertilizer industry? And how do our gardening practices contribute to this? There are two big reasons. First, the manufacture and shipment of chemical fertilizers is a major source of greenhouse gases, both because of the high energy needed for production, but also for the gases that are produced in the manufacturing process. That's number one. So manufacturing, especially, and shipping this stuff all over the country. Second, soil that's treated with chemical fertilizer has very little capacity to store carbon. Because again, what's happening is the chemicals are killing off that robust soil ecosystem. The chemicals are feeding the plant directly without going through all those other soil food web processes are not working. And so we're losing that carbon capacity reservoir of soil when we use chemical fertilizers. So interestingly, and some of you may know this, the rise of chemical fertilizers is related to World War I and II. And so nitrogen in our environment that's necessary for plant growth, we all know like plants need lots of nitrogen, right? Nitrogen in the atmosphere is inert. It's N2, two little nitrogen atoms hooked together. But in the early 1900s, a German chemist named Fritz Haber developed this high temperature, energy intensive method to synthesize plant available nitrate from air. That one invention was what has changed the world for both the production of bombs and the production of fertilizer. The major use of this process in World War I and in World War II was for bomb production, because what nitrogen was needed for all these bombs. But by the end of World War II, the United States had, I think it was something like 10 different major manufacturing industries focused on bomb production, and they wanted to continue. They wanted to continue to have their companies, so they switched to fertilizer production. So that's why that production of fertilizer is really related to the post-World War II era, and that is what's happened to chemical fertilizer production since. Now, interestingly, a couple years ago, I think it was 2019 or so, the Environmental Defense Fund and the Cornell University also found out that fertilizer plants themselves are emitting about 100 times the methane that they report to the EPA. Of course, today we hardly have an EPA at all, so things aren't getting better, but it's important to realize again that this greenhouse gas, methane, which is so important as a greenhouse gas, is very much an output from fertilizer production. And so to some, in the short term, chemical fertilizers do tend to increase crop yields, but they don't do so in the long term. And along the way, they're contributing to the loss of the soil structure, they're altering the pH, they're killing off the beneficial bacteria and the fungi that system needs. And so because they're reducing the life in the soil, they're reducing the soil friability, and that increases the potential for soil compaction, it reduces drainage, and reduces air circulation. So you have that effect on soil, and then you have the fact that these chemical fertilizers themselves are significant sources of pollution, because often they're applied in a way where there's an excess, it washes into the groundwater. And so this whole combination is like, we need to just wean ourselves entirely from chemical fertilizers. That's a big ask, but that's what we need to do. It really is, if we're going to have a sustainable future with life for humans on Earth. So again, if we go organic, what do we need? Well, the best thing are the things on our properties, leaves, pine needles from our own landscapes, from our friends, compost tea. Manure is organic, but it's high in nitrogen, so don't put For the most part, you don't want to use manure directly. You want to be careful about how you mix it in. But animal products are valuable for their role in the cycling in bone meal, blood meal. I do use bone meal a fair amount when I'm planting a landscape in a garden because it's a great organic source of phosphorus for the roots of plants. And phosphorus is what's really important for those plants to get established because phosphorus stimulates the root growth. And when you plant seeds or new plants, you don't want to give them a lot of nitrogen anyway, because that stimulates too much leaf growth and then they can't sustain it because their root systems aren't strong enough. So the thing that you most want to give plants when they're newly put into the ground is bone meal and phosphorus. And so what are your best organic fertilizers? Well, it's your leaf litter and it's the decaying plant material in your own landscape. So again, as much as possible, let that work itself. Before we came along, nobody came to the woods and applied fertilizer. Nobody came to the meadows and applied fertilizers. It's really our lawns and our entire ethic of landscaping that's kind of changed the way we approach things. And composts, of course, are good. And then there are some good organic products on the market as well. So I can't finish without mentioning my favorite subject, which is leaf blowers. And I have a very hard time understanding why in this era of climate change, which we can all see and we can all feel, that we even allow these things to be used at all. That's my personal judgment about them. They are extremely hazardous to our health. They create noise, which is deafening. It's horrible to be around them. I mean, if you encounter someone with a leaf blower, do you go towards them or do you run away? And that should tell us something. They're a huge source of air pollution because it's a two-stroke engine that burns oil and gas together. So you can read all the kinds of different estimates you want. But I would say it's reliable to say that, the amount of hydrocarbons they emit is vastly greater than any automobile. And of course, automobiles have changed over time, but they're emitting huge amounts of particulate matter, huge amounts of carbon dioxide, and significantly more pollution than any car on the market, even old cars that aren't up to current standards, air quality standards. They harm the topsoil. They harm the plants. When they're run at high speed, the air is hot and it's 200 miles per hour. Do you want to put 200 miles per hour hot air on your plants? They desiccate the plants. They blow away the topsoil. They spread the spores, they spread, fungi, and then they spread all this dust and pollen and mold in the atmosphere that we breathe when we walk by them. And then they're a major source of disturbance. So why are we using these things? Silence is golden. And that's a proverb attributed to Thomas Carlyle, and it's not just a song from the 60s, but it's a great one. So, how do we sum this up? Show our love. Show our love. Leave the leaves, minimizing our cutback and deadheading of our perennials in the garden. More utilization. Leave the snags as much as possible, unless they're doing any harm. We leave the snags, we're going to see so many more birds. When I walk, Piper Shores has 2 campuses, and when I walk between them, I go through a wetland area, and there's so many snags. That's where I see the most birds. It's wonderful. So use your snags, use your brush, use your logs, and go organic. Really go organic. It's part of our climate action at every level. So what does this mean for the fall cleanup? This is the conventional prescription for the fall cleanup: collect and get rid of the leaves, fertilize the lawn, go around and aerate the lawn. Why? Because the soil's not in good condition. Do a short mow, cut back your perennials, etc. So I'm going to suggest modifications to the tradition. Do a final mow. Doesn't really have to be short. Mulch your perennials, and by that I don't mean bring in mulch, but let's say where the leaf litter is there, you for the most part want to leave it. If a lot of leaves have blown into that section, it might be that there's an excess, and people often say, well, can I take the leaves out and grind them up and put them back? You can, but if you do that, you're grinding up all those caterpillars and moths that are trying to reproduce. So grinding them up is not something I would recommend unless it's an area where you really like have to lead them. And what do you do about the turf? People say, what do I do about the turf? Use a mulching mower. Stop taking, when you cut grass where there is turf, don't take the cuttings off the grass. Cut it with a mulching mower. If it has some clumps, run over it twice so that it really can be distributed and again become part of the soil. Yep, drain your hoses, shut those off. If you have gutters, clean them, or maybe we don't have to clean them anymore because we have very nice people that do it for us. And so the new fall cleanup, leave the leaves as much as possible. Please rake them, don't blow them. Do your final mow. Enjoy your garden, etc. But hey, let's go for a bike ride, guys. That's a lot more fun than being out in the garden and slaving away. And it's my favorite part of fall. So thank you.